We will have, since the outbreak of the pandemic, we all realized what it means to be hybrid. So in this session, we are hybrid. I'm happy to hand over to, again, a distinguished moderator, which you already heard today, Misha Glenny, Rector of the Institute for Human Sciences. The topic of this session is, how will the European Union be transformed? Misha, I'm happy to hand over the floor to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Boris, and welcome to this session. I cannot begin to compete with the moving and elegant testimony of Olga and Marta, and you've heard quite enough from me today already. So I have to explain to you that the hybrid nature of this session has created certain complications because Franziska Brantner, who is the Parliamentary State Secretary at the German Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action, is not yet with us. It appears as though she may join us by mobile phone, but we're not entirely sure when yet. So that means that I know that's the bad news, but the good news is we get all the more of, you all know him, you all love him, Ivan Krastev, who is going to explain to us exactly how the European Union will be transformed by the events in Ukraine. Ivan, the floor is yours.
First, it's great because now, not knowing when Franziska is coming, we're in a situation much close to the reality in which we're living, because this is where basically it is. I'll try to be very short, because in a certain way and brief, because the discussion already started, and I will just try to make 4 points to push in the direction that we already started, because also what Andreas Streicher was saying, we believe, I'm not so sure that China is going to benefit. We expect that the Americans are going to benefit. We know that Ukraine is going to pay a very high economic cost, and we know also that Russia is going to pay a cost. But where is the European Union in all this? And I'll start with the fact that normally when you talk about turning points like this one, people believe that in a turning points, you start to see future differently. But in my view, the situation is slightly different. In a turning point, you start to reinterpret the past, and particularly the recent past. It's not that now we see better how the European Union is going to be, but we are starting to have a different view what has happened, for example, in the last 30 years. And from this point of view, this crisis, on one level, very much resembles the 3 major crises that European Union was shattered by in the last 10 years. Financial, refugee, war in Donbass. This is the second coming of each of these crises. In a certain way, if you go on the financial side, and Andreas was already talking about this, listen, this is going to be nasty. This is not simply that you have a high public debt already on the government sector, and basically because of the fact that we spend a lot of money on the COVID, but you're going to have inflation. Talking about Central Europe, some of the highest inflation is going to be in Central and East European countries. Poland is around 14. Estonia, Kaja Kallas, is around 14, 15. And this is going to create a level of political instability in each of the countries, which is part of the war in Ukraine. Because in a way, the war in Ukraine is 3 different wars. One is what is happening on the battlefield, and this is where the Ukrainian army is fighting the Russian army. The second is the economic war, and basically the sanctions around Russia. And the third is what is happening on the level of the public opinion and on the information war. And these 3 wars are not going to end at the same time. Quite probably the economic war is going to continue even if we're going to have a certain type of a ceasefire. I'm saying this because for me the most important is that when you go back, suddenly we're shocked by the following discovery. That we feel threatened not by our failures but by our successes. I have heard a lot of people lecturing about Germans and France having a wrong policy about Russia in the last 10 years. What was their policy? Economic interdependence. But it was European Union. European Union was about economic interdependence, trading with the enemy and trying to transform the enemy basically into a friend in a certain way was very at the heart of European experience. In a certain way, what French and German did, and it didn't work, was they universalized the experience of post-World War II. Trading with others was the way to try, you believe that it is going to reduce the risk of war. But what we know from history is that when you trade with others, particularly if this other basically is not going to change their intentions, this is increasing the risk of war. This is creating certain vulnerability that you very much see in the energy sector now. And of course, there is a very legitimate question why Germany decided after 2015 to increase their energy dependence on Russia. But to ask the questions why in the 1990s Germans or French were pursuing the policy of economic interdependence and believing that through modernization they're going to change Russia, this is the game. This was what European Union was doing to everybody, to the Chinese, to Central and East Europeans, to others. And I'm saying this because we understand that our most important policy did not bring the results that we expected, that we have been trading, and as a result of it, we're in a situation of a higher risk and vulnerability. The second story is about soft power and military power. It was Europeans with a very good kind of an argument saying, listen, military power does not work. Look at the Americans in Iraq, look there. Military power does not have a purchase power. And we have been very strong criticizing others, saying, you are not going to solve any problem with military means. By the way, this was a typical German statement about every conflict, also Austrian. Even before knowing what is the conflict, we're saying that there is no military solution. And listen, there is no military solution, particularly if you don't have a military. But then suddenly you start to understand that you have a defense problem, and this kind of a defense problem cannot be simply neutralized by soft power. And then you should change. But you're changing something that is not simply a policy. For Germany, you're changing an identity. Being a civilian power, this was what Germany learned out of their post-World War II experience. So it is easy to increase military budgets, but just by increasing military budgets, you are not creating a military power overnight, because you should try to transform society to understand and to totally differently look at the role of the military power. I'm saying all this because these are not trivial challenges about one wrong policy or one politician doing something wrong. Suddenly, European Union has awakened to the world in which we feel uncomfortable. And even the relations with the United States. I heard a lot about European unity and power. Imagine for the moment that this crisis is going to happen at the moment when President Trump is the President of the United States. Do you believe that the response was going to be the same? Do you believe that the relations between European Union and the United States was going to be the same, even if the United States was going to have a tough position on Russia? I'm saying all this because suddenly we are pushed to revisit all the major instruments with which European Union have been working, including enlargement. Listen, all the things that we're talking about is not a classical enlargement. Even the four freedoms, this is great, but part of the problem of the four freedoms is that you're going to get this, but of course you're not going to be part of decision-making. You're not going to have veto. So let's be honest. And I do believe it's a good policy, but this is it about. And if you're a big country like Ukraine, are you ready basically to consume policies, including economic policies and others, without being part of the decision-making? This was also the experience of Turkey on the customs union. So we are pushed to rethink things that are very important for us. And even going on the climate, something important things that Hedda was saying. If you're a Polish prime minister, are you really going to believe that you're going to get out of coal? In the moment when you see basically Russia going to your border, you said it's a security issue. Climate change is a problem, but problem which can be faced in 20 years. Russia is a problem which I'm facing now. And the fact that we didn't talk Russia is also very typical, because in a certain way, we know that Russia is a big problem, but there is no long-term Russia policy. neither on our side nor on the American side. I'm saying all this because, in my view, this is why European Union is going to be transformed, not because we're going to have a different vision, but because in order to be effective, we start to adjust to the world in which things that worked yesterday are not going to work tomorrow. After the end of the Cold War, Stefan's Lehne former colleague, Robert Cooper, invented a stamp. He was then in the British Foreign Service, and the stamp was OBE, overtaken by events. And he asked all his staff basically to go through the files and to put the stamp where it is needed. And we are now with the files in which there is too much overtaken by events. And I'm saying this because, and this is the three last points I want to do, which I found critically important. If till yesterday, European Union was really very well characterized by its soft power. And this is why European Union was a union with soft borders, because we believed that we are bordering future members, regardless in which direction. Suddenly, we need borders that can be defended. And then we should know where the borders are. And this is the major challenge with countries like Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine. They are within the borders of the Western sphere of influence, because now we clearly see that there is sphere of influence, there is a Russian sphere of influence, and Belarus is there. By the way, Belarus was the next, in a way, while we were talking about other things. But then you have a totally different type of border. For the first time, we're talking about hard borders and soft budgets. This is also a new reality. And this is not only with respect to Russia. The relations with Turkey are much more difficult. This is why the problem of the Western Balkans is becoming a geopolitical reality much more than ever before. But when you talk in terms of geopolitics, then some of the other value issues are framed differently. You go to eat cebapche with President Vučić not to talk about the freedom of media, but to talk about sanctions on Russia. And this is a trade-offs. And to try to believe that we are not going to be forced to put and have hard choices. This works for a conference, but it's not going to work if you're basically in the position of Habeck or basically what we're going to see from Franziska. And I'm saying this because this is something that, in my view, is important for our debates. The war generation, people like Isaiah Berlin, they knew that when you're choosing, you very rarely choose between good and evil. And when you're making choices, most often you're sacrificing a value, something that is important for you. We try to believe that basically when we make choices, we're never going to sacrifice a value. And this is the situation which is pushing us to understand that this is not the case. Then we go to the problem of resilience. Some people know I have an obsession with opinion polls. And this is what I know about opinion polls. When we talk today about the support for Ukraine, and I'm not talking about Bulgaria or Greece or Slovakia, you have a public opinion being very sympathetic, really trying to help, and you have all these millions of people that are taking Ukrainian families in their houses. Never bet that in 4 or 5 months the situation is going to be the same. Listen, it is not easy to have an Ukrainian family in your house in Poland during the winter. Not because people are bad, but because what Kaja Kallas is saying, don't get tired, is not easy, even in a conference. So from this point of view, we should be prepared that there are going to be shifts in public opinions. Secondly, economic sanctions on Russia are going to have a cost, and to be honest, Russians are going to increase the cost. You can rely on this. And thirdly, even our talk about justice, don't talk to a war criminal. Believe me, we're going to talk to a war criminal. And we have been talking to war criminals most of the time. And we have been talking to Milosevic, who even didn't have a nuclear power, and we have been talking to other people. So as a result of it, European Union is pushed not simply in a realpolitik, but in a situation in which we should try to use other policies in order to keep ourselves together. But there is also an opportunity, and here the idea of resilience is important for me. When we started the sanctions, we didn't believe that this is going to change Putin's policy. Recently, somebody who was talking to the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov and asked him who are the 3 closest advisors to President Putin these days. And the answer, what he got was the three closest advisors to President Putin today are Ivan the Terrible, Ekaterina the Great, and Peter the Great. So from this point of view, if you're in this historical mindset, you're not going to change your policy by sanctions. You're sanctioning for two reasons. First, to reduce the capacity of the Russian state, but secondly, to show them that we are ready to pay the cost of the sanctions, that we are serious. In a certain way, this is our capacity to endure pain that is going to change Russian policies, and not our capacity to inject pain on Russia on its own. And this is a difficult story, because Polish Prime Minister used to say you should choose between peace and air conditioning. And do you know what? People said there is no peace without air conditioning. So this kind of a story and the change which we're going to see in our public opinion, in our political process, is part of the European transformation that we also should be ready to talk. And I'm making my last point, and because this was a point that in my view has been touched by several colleagues. This is a European moment like the COVID was, because suddenly we're deciding much faster. We're doing much more things collectively than before. Some of these things are really brave, because when President Zelensky or Kuleba are saying Europeans are slow, they don't know how fast we are. In fact, we can be very slow. In a certain way, both Americans and Europeans had with such a fast delivery that if you're staying in European institutions, you're going to be shocked. And Nicola knows how slow we can be. Because we understand that this is a critical moment. This is about European Union. This is really about the European Union. But then it's also a nationalist moment. Because all the mobilization that you're seeing are very much experienced through kind of the national experience of all the states. Carolina was saying, we are afraid that we are going to lose its sovereignty. Yes, this is how Poles or Baltics see it. Germans had the feeling that they're living in a different world because the history has returned and probably they are not ready for this. I'm saying this because for me, how to reconcile this nationalistic mobilization, which understands that not only Ukrainians are going to sacrifice, but we are going to sacrifice, but at the same time that this nationalist moment can be mobilized as a European moment, for me this is the story. Because it is enough 3 elections to go wrong in the European Union. With the current structure of the Union, with the veto power of the every member state, we are going to be in a totally different conversations. So this is why the public opinion ended up to be so important in this war. Because there are 2 things that explain why Europe reacted so differently today than in 2014. Listen, in 2014, from the legal point of view, this was the same. A country violated the sovereignty of European state, grasped its territory, put it, basically annexed it. But why we didn't react? Because Ukrainians did not fight in Crimea. Because Yanukovych has demoralized the armed forces to the extent that it was 20,000 Ukrainian troops in Crimea and they did nothing. The moment when Ukrainians fought back, Europeans were ready to stand. But the second thing that, in my view, is changed dramatically is that when Europeans saw Ukrainians fighting this fight, we basically were impressed. We knew that this is also up to us. And I'm saying this ending on the fact that this third war about the public opinion, particularly in European Union, is going to be the most difficult one. And in a certain way, this is the one in which we participate. On economic sanctions, there are other people that are going to decide. On basically what is happening on the ground in Ukraine, the Ukrainians are taking the risk. But this is the war in which we can participate, and here comes the real challenge. Resilience starts with knowing well your own society. How to push, but to the extent not to make basically your push overcome. How to do it in the way to sustain the moment that you have. So I'm going to end up here, and then Francisco probably is waiting from somewhere to come.
Well, for once I'm rather sad that Ivan has kept in time. because we don't yet have Franziska Brantner on the line. So I'm going to start the discussion, but I have to warn the discussants that I may brutally intervene at any moment in case Frau Brantner is... Oh, here she is. How fantastic. So I will address her. Franziska Brantner, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, great. Hello, it's Misha Glenny here. I'm moderating the session with you and with Ivan Krastev. I know that we don't have a huge amount of time. We're very grateful for you for making the time for this conference in the session called How Will the European Union Be Transformed? And I guess I'd like to ask you, because in our previous session there was a lot of talk about Germany and whether Germany has got sufficient political will to make the bold steps which a lot of people here around the conference table feel are required in terms of engaging with Ukraine and indeed the Western Balkans on the issue of enlargement, but also other issues as well. So please, we will listen to you for however much time you've got. The floor is yours.
Sorry, my daughter's here with me, so it's a bit of a crazy day. First of all, I wanted to say, because the question is, how will the European Union be transformed? I think that the European Union is transforming constantly, and that it has been transformative since its creation, and that it probably will be a transformative process for its member states and for its own institutions for as long as it will last. And that sometimes you maybe should also recognize how much it has transformed us and how much it has changed over the last couple of decades. And secondly, will Germany be ready enough to take bold steps? I think, the Western Balkans, to be frank, it wasn't Germany the problem in the past, it was much more France. But I think that President Macron has come around now and seen that being against enlargement in the Western Balkan was, more a populist at home term than really strategic sovereignty politics. And I hope that this recent awareness is going to last. And I think, it's important that if we talk about strategic sovereignty and our neighborhood, that then we don't get blown away by populist negative feelings about some of these countries and enlargement. So, dare to be, seriously, I think we will have hopefully positive steps the next couple of weeks and months even, so that we can further advance. I think that this would be very needed for the EU to go ahead and be a real actor in its own neighborhood. Secondly, Germany, we have in our coalition treaty that we want to have treaty changes, that we want to have a convention in order to adjust the institutions of the European Union. Also to really change its decision-making structures when it comes to foreign security policy, to move from unanimity to qualified majority. And there my question is rather if other member states are ready to take that step. And the question is that if we are not all ready to do this, if those who want to go deeper in the integration, foreign security policy, defense policy, if we are ready to go ahead with a few. I think these will be bold questions. And maybe, we have to create like with Schengen, with the Euro, go and build own structures before everybody else will join. And I think this will be important over the next couple of months, maybe years, if we do advance or if we stay with the structures we have. And the third large point, which I see where we really have challenges, is of course on the internal questions of the rule of law in some member states. We see these days with, Orban after his re-election, it was very evident before and then after the elections that, once re-elected, he would be, again, a difficult partner when it comes to being forceful towards Putin and Xi Jinping. And when you see the policies he does, and, be it a level of train building, etc., he goes with Chinese and not European operators, etc. So he brings all the the elements that undermine our strategic sovereignty. So the question is, how do we deal with actors like him? And I think we don't really have an answer to that yet. And that might also lead us, to rethink our institutional setup. And then the other question will be, how do we, do, and it's sort of a catchwords these days, solidarity, but really, how do we co-define economic interests? And I think that this has become again very strongly visible in the crisis now. How do we deal with high energy prices across the EU, which are a consequence of the war and Putin's action? So how do we deal with it in a solidarity way? And there, I think it's a good question to Germany, because we are among the most dependent, but we are in Austria, you're even in a worse situation. So, in a way, I think these will be difficult questions for us if we do a realign on energy, if we do realign on imports, exports. I'm quite hopeful when I see what the Commission has been proposing 2 days ago in the Repower EU. It has a strong raw material component as well. So it might be that we're going to get on good track. And again, if some do not want to join, then probably we really soon need the courage to go ahead with those who are ready to do so. And make sure that we have a social, really prolongment or accompaniment of the transformations that are happening. I think that will be one of the key, really challenges to Europe, to get the question of Verteilungsfragen in German, the questions of distribution of wealth, right? I think they will be at the forefront of the debate over the next couple of months and years again. Very classical distributional questions. And I think that we will have to prove that we can live up to our social fabric and defend it. But I don't think it will be easy. So far from my side, how will the union be transformed? I think if you're courageous, do not forget the social side, and are courageous in case it needs to be to go ahead with a few.
Francisca, thank you very much. Can I abuse my position of chair at the moment and ask you a question? There's been some discussion here about the desirability of offering Ukraine EU candidacy status. Is that something which the German government is considering seriously at the moment, or does it prefer to remain outside those debates?
No, we do debate it. It's not that we have an answer yet. I can give you my personal response. I'm in favor of it, but it's, also I can see the arguments against it. But it's, we don't have a final government position yet. And I think it is not an easy one. You do not want to create wrong hopes. At the same time, you want to send strong signals. And I think it could only happen if it is accompanied also by a strong process with the Western Balkans, if we solve the North Macedonia, etc. question. So I think that this is also important to have in mind.
And just as a quick follow-up, you mentioned that, which was very interesting, you said that you personally, in principle, are in favor. Those who are against it, are you talking about fellow members of the coalition?
I think it's not a party line question. It would be wrong to say sort of the Greens are this and the Liberals are this and the Social Democrats are this. I think it is really basically a difficult assessment to do. Maybe because we know, I think we're really trying to think through what the consequences will be what is positive about it, what is might also be undesirable effects, and how you have to accompany it. Maybe you have to give it a different framework. So I think maybe the answer will be more complex than just candidacy status, yes or no. And maybe there might be some part of the answer.
Thanks very much indeed. That's absolutely terrific. We've got one more issue that was raised, and then I'll let you go. And that was, it was pointed out that the Ukrainians who are fleeing the war zone at the moment and who are fleeing Ukraine have been granted the 4 freedoms of the European Union. Is it feasible, as far as you're concerned, to argue for the maintenance of those 4 freedoms after the war is over, in order to maintain the sense of integration for Ukraine, or is that too much of a political ask at the moment?
They had visa liberalization before. You're right that now they're allowed to, work and study very easily. Will it be maintained? I don't have an answer to that yet. I can only tell you that it's also, we have to watch what it makes to others who have come earlier. We have in Germany many Syrians who still are not allowed to work partially. And sometimes they're sitting in the same asylum center, in some small villages. And it creates also, a feeling of injustice. And I think that we have to, give the flexibility to Ukrainians, but then also live up to those who are, desperately here, who have fled another war fought by Putin. And I was in a room, 2 weeks ago, and it was like, I was almost, cracking down, because there I had a Syrian sitting at an Ukrainian woman, and they were talking about the way how Putin bombs and what kind of bombs he uses to shell cities. And they were just exchanging and discussing, and it was evident that they said, it's just the same methods used on, Idlib than in Ukraine. And you had these 2 refugees from the same aggressor, Putin, sitting in my constituency and exchanging about it. And one has the right to work immediately and the other not. And that creates questions that we, at least in Germany, I don't know how it's in Austria, we have to answer. I think it's right to ask how will it be prolonged after the war, where we also have to address these other questions and do not forget where we come from and what atrocities Putin has committed elsewhere, and that we have to be consistent.
Thank you very much, Frau Brantner. We are really grateful that you've made the time to join us this afternoon, and for answering those questions, as well as your keynote speech. I'm sure there are members of the panel who you already know who will be keeping in touch and keeping you abreast of developments here from Vienna. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for having hosted me, and sorry for the delays. It's been a parliamentary week, and these are always a bit crazy. Thank you.
No problem. Great. Well, after that, we can go back to the panel, or indeed start the panel discussion. And Ivana, you were the first to go. Off you go.
Thank you so much. I have maybe a question or a comment for Ivan or whoever wants to pick up. Both Gerard and you mentioned Second Coming. He was mentioning Second Treaty of Rome. And I remember a poem which I quoted in my book, it's Second Coming of Yeats, who says, it talks also about center. I wanted to tell something about in your panel, but I'll use it now. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. And then we come to the Second Coming. But talking about the Second Coming that is being on the table after a conference on the future of Europe, which can maybe be some kind of legitimization of the public opinion that we're afraid of or refer to or rely on. How do we manage public opinions and EU Council, dear Prime Ministers, in this debate that we have with two non-papers, one pro-treaty change, others against, qualified majority, convention, which the lady mentioned, and yeah, I would leave it to that, because, you know, Article 48, I think, of the treaty basically gives the floor to the parliament to put the proposition of the convention, and we saw it. But how do we bridge this gap? Because I know, for example, in Croatia, we have a strong opposition. We have a government who says the crisis is not time to be brave. That's my reinterpretation, not like that. So, I don't know, I would like your comment. How do we come from here? Will the second coming be some kind of revelation and hope and new beginning? Or will we, you know, stay as we were up until this point, where we let this happen? Thank you.
Thank you, Ivana. Olivia was the next one I saw.
We missed a war. Up until the 22nd of February, we did not believe that a war would happen. We missed a war on a continent that said, never again. If we missed a war, then my first question, answering this original question, how will the EU be transformed, is what else are we missing? Are we having the right conversation? And Ivan, I loved a lot of things that you said in your intervention, and particularly this notion essentially that we're headed into a moment of history where we have to question or revisit this notion of how to use economic interdependencies in relation to peace, and whether or not we can still do it. But you said something that sends me a bit into a state of panic, which is climate change, we can deal with it in 20 years. And it doesn't send me into a state of panic because of this statement, which has to do with climate change, but with the fact that we do not understand how we can fight climate change. We are under a legal obligation, I said it this morning, to decarbonize by at least 55% of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. The latest IPCC report tells us that we may very well come into a world of 1.5 degree increase as soon as 2025. This is going to have some massive repercussions in terms of food and water security, in terms of economic interdependencies in trade, and in terms of geographical and resource distribution across the world. Russia has understood that. Russia is now sitting on a number of resources which the EU needs in order to decarbonize, which the EU needs in order to deliver on its democratic and social pact within the next 7 years. All of what Russia is doing at the moment is connected to an industrial strategy, a technological strategy for how to deal with a decarbonized world, knowing that the EU has made a pledge to decarbonize, but we are not in an industrial and technological capacity to deliver if we do not have access to certain key materials, some of which, I repeat, are found in Ukraine. It is not a coincidence if Ukraine was only one of 2 countries with which the EU struck a strategic partnership to diversify its supply chains to deal with climate change, to deal with a fundamental geo-economic shift, which is going to be about what kind of political equilibrium of power do we have in a climate-disrupted world. In order to decarbonize, technically we should have dealt with this 20 years ago in order to be ready, in order to deliver by 2030. The next best option is now, and if Russia as well as China and other countries, sit on the technical capacities and the raw materials necessary for the EU to deliver on its decarbonization pledge, then we have a democratic, a socio-economic, a political, and a fundamentally geopolitical problem. How should the European Union change if we missed a war, even though we had, as Sirhi was saying this morning, plenty of examples as of 2014, that it was essentially a plan in the works? When did we lose the capacity and competency for strategic intelligence? Especially when we have some units within the EAS, within the Commission, within some states that are supposedly about strategic foresight and intelligence. How could we not see that? How can we not see what's at stake when indeed Ukraine is essentially what I would call ground zero for transition warfare? Ground zero for something which is about renegotiating the global balance of power. And where Russia is trying to play catch up with China and trying to become a geo-economic power broker in the new energy mix, in the new industrial and technological mix of the EU. So let's start, not just from the climate perspective, but let's start by recovering some strategic intelligence as a competency within the EU. Let's start by understanding that the transition is not just a technical, financial, and material matter. It is a geopolitical one and a geo-economic one. And by now, what we're up against is probably facing some actors such as Russia and China, which are considering the transition as a matter of geostrategy. And I'll end with this. If you look at the news this week, everybody is going into panic over food crises and a massive famine in the works today. What does this say about Russia? We're focusing essentially on the part where Russia is trying to blockade some food delivery or some staple crop delivery as a way to lessen the impact of sanctions. But what does it say about the future? When food crises will be multiple, when there will be breadbasket failures, when there will be water failures, and where Russia has said it explicitly that it wants to project itself into this future as a food provider, as a bully under the guise of a savior.
Thank you very much, Olivia. We have a lot of people who want to contribute, and we have 45 minutes, and so my maths is rubbish, but I'm going to arbitrarily say that people should speak for 3 minutes, and then I will intervene. I'm now going to be outrageous and ask Maxim Trudolyubov to take the floor, even though he's only just put up his thing, because we haven't heard a voice from Russia yet, and I'd very much like to do so. So Maxim, the floor is yours, and I'll give you an extra minute. So you've got 4 minutes.
Thank you, Misha, but I'm not going to be talking for a long time. Basically, it's a question. I think that everybody realizes that until Putin remains in Moscow, head of Russia, he will continue fighting in one way or another. We don't know how this war ends, and probably we'll discuss it later on. So far, we don't really see a clear-cut ending of that would, be a defeat, that could be defined as a defeat, which perhaps means that he will continue fighting by other means, and that's energy, that's food, all kinds of other resources, information, you name it. So basically the question is, I think, for how long and which parts of Europe are prepared to endure economic pain in one way or another. Again, energy, right now we don't see an oil embargo. So far it's been a hard sell. And I understand it's not just Hungary, it's not just Orban. It's a very difficult thing. Gas, obviously, is even more difficult. You cannot reroute the pipelines. So, to what can we just simply think in those terms, like 1 year, 2 years of pain, which we cannot probably measure exactly at this point, but it definitely will be something. So, on the surface of things, we do see energy, an energy war perhaps, migration. Clearly, he will do anything to make sure this continues, and it is painful. Food, perhaps, which could work indirectly through poorer regions or more dependent regions, let's say in Africa, which might cause a wave of migration as well. So basically the question is, to what extent, yes, now it is, I understand, is a moment of solidarity with Ukraine, and Europe feels supportive, and it has been pointed out, populations, citizenry is even more decisive in this than the governments and politicians. But for how long this continues? Clearly, time is, my impression, time is not on Europe's side in that, because Putin can endure costs. I mean, it doesn't really hit him. He doesn't pay. The Russians do. From oligarchs to, simple folk, but he doesn't.
Thank you very much, Maxine. Marina, would you like to go next?
So no, I am not a politologist, but a theater critic, so maybe my thoughts will be a bit naive. But I think that we traditionally and spontaneously continue to think in terms of national states all the time, and we are speaking about contradictions between different states and about different perspectives from, Poland or from France and so on and so on. But maybe today the most important thing is the contradictions within countries. Of course, I can give a lot of examples like France, Poland, Hungary, and so on, with this right-wing politician movement there. But I will give another example. It's not a part of European Union, but it's a very interesting example. It's Belarus. And we saw some years ago, 2 years ago, that there were big rallies against Lukashenko, and it was like more than a million of people which went to the streets, and they were very brave, actually, unlike Russian people. And then what happened, that they were torturing in the jail in Krastev street by another people from Belarus, like then I often remembered it when I read these articles about what happened in Bucha, because it was the same thing these Russian soldiers did with Ukrainian people there. So in some point, I thought that it's like external continuation of these internal conflicts. And what to do with this? That there are some people with liberal democratic values which live in all the countries, and these Belarusian people which went to the protests in the streets, and I would say some Hungarian people, they have a lot in common, but they cannot be united at the special movement, because it's very important now to think how to rebuild not only European Union, but the whole world, where these people, regardless of their citizenship, will be united somehow and will become a real political force. Because these nationalists of different countries, they cannot be actually united. There's a Hungarian nationalists and Romanian nationalists, they will always have a lot of contradictions. But people with liberal, democratic mindset, they can unite their efforts. And not the countries, but the people from different countries, they should be somehow united, and they can do it. And if we rebuild our way of thinking, maybe it will help us to rebuild the world and the European Union as a part of the world.
Thank you very much, Marina. I'm now going to go over to the other side, to Sławek there, who's been very patient. He comes next.
One footprint to Ivan about Belarus, so I'll continue this way. I think thanks to Ukrainian and Belarusian civil society, Belarusians just defended, at least partly, sovereignty. I mean, look what they did. They stopped the war from the Belarusian direction, the infantry. The saboteurs did a lot of damage to the moves of Ukrainian army. The cyber partisans did a lot of damage. And even Lukashenko himself did everything what it takes to not to join the war. Of course, he's an aggressor from the point of view that the rockets are coming from Belarus, but he did not join. It's a big thing, and I don't want Belarus to disappear again for the next 30 years or 20 years from our map, because the people are still there. 80% of Belarusians are very pro-Western. It's a part of the West mentally. It's just a question of time. It can be 100 years. I don't know. But let's think about them again as well. Let's include them. But my point is that I'm not sure who is more dependent on who concerning EU and Ukraine. Ukrainians are deciding about the result of war, and the result of war will decide about the role of EU. Who led us to the breakthrough in Germany? Who led us, Zeitwende, it's a big word, who led us to the breakthrough in EU's politics? Who will pay for the war? Americans will pay probably 1/3 for the military, but 2/3, pensions, every other things will be paid by EU. Energetic crisis, even food crisis, EU as a big humanitarian actor, and of course refugee crisis. And it's a first real occasion to take a serious role as a security actor in the world for EU, and maybe the last chance as well. Imagine that the war, and this is very probable, will be a very long-term war. You're going to have Israel next to EU. For sure, you're going to have a militarization going on in Ukraine. What that means for the EU, and if the EU has any idea. What we heard now is that, well, maybe yes, maybe not, like from the German representative. I'm not surprised. This is actually what I expected. And just a last thing, maybe about the American that were dragged in here, willingly or not, and the question of European solidarity sovereignty, as I said. You know what when was the last time America declared the war? It was 1942 against Hungary, Romania, and I think Bulgaria, allies of Adolf Hitler. From then on, America is doing special military operations. And what you're gonna have, and what you can have, and what America is prepared for, it's an ongoing special military operation here in Ukraine. I don't see much determination, ideas and integrity, consistency in EU to take any position, to play actually any role here. So I'm actually looking more about what's going on in Ukraine rather than what's going on in Brussels.
Thank you, Suave. Well, this is turning out to be a very cheerful conversation. Natalie Tocci, are we back to glass half full?
I wasn't quite going to go there. No, what I was going to say is that, I think Ivan very compellingly sort of put the political question in terms of, Europe's staying power over this war and the political sort of, preconditions for it. I think that when it comes to Europe's staying power, and more broadly, I would say, are we going to be able to, quote unquote, seize the opportunity of this war in terms of making steps forward, be it on the deepening and on the widening? I think it is important to sort of raise what the big dilemmas ahead of us are. I mean, let me park the enlargement question because we've already discussed it and what the dilemmas there are. And let me just take the three other issues which we've discussed slightly less. Firstly, European defense. Now, okay, it's great. We all know that we need to get more serious on defense. Having said this, I think what is also clear is that if there is one organization that is not brain dead these days, that is NATO. So if NATO is going to be principally concerned with the defense of Europe, where does this leave European defense? So what is it that European defense does beyond member states spending money on defense as they should be? And I don't think we have a good answer to that question. I think there are good candidates for the question, Is something that European defense should be doing, for instance, a CSDP operation to get the grain out of Ukraine? We have the capability of doing it. A good humanitarian operation with force protection on the invitation of the Ukrainian government to get the grain out of the port of Odessa. But do we have the political will to take that risk? And this is something that only Europeans could do. I mean, God forbid, NATO could not do something like this. I mean, and then we'd be back into the whole, going into a third world war. Anyway, sort of dilemmas on defense. Dilemmas on energy, and I think Olivia kind of spoke about this very compellingly. It's good that we're back in a world in which we're taking energy security seriously. We'd kind of forgotten about it between 2014 and sort of September, October of last year, because we lived in the illusion, actually, that this would be magically resolved through the transition. Eventually it will, but the transition means that there is a transition. So we're not quite there now. So it's good to an extent that we have recognized that this is something that we have to take seriously again. And yet, although in terms of our rhetoric, what we say is that energy security and the energy transition go hand in hand, the truth of the matter is that the policy decisions that are being taken may end up taking us in a very different direction, where energy security is secured through the diversification of fossil relationships rather than through the energy transition. And then thirdly, I think there is the refugee issue and therefore the EU's asylum policy. And I think the points that Franziska were making were important ones. Absolutely, we should move forward in terms of, the ideas that Gerard was presenting in terms of how to make the rights being granted today to Ukrainian refugees permanent, but I think this still leaves unanswered the question of what to do about refugees in general. And if we don't tackle that question, where is that going to leave the European Union in terms of the way in which it's viewed in the global south, where very clearly we're losing the battle of narratives? And I'll stop there.
That's a very important point about losing the battle of narratives in the global south, because Russia is really not engaged in a narrative war here in Europe or in the United States. It's focusing entirely on Africa, Asia and South America, and as you say, we're losing that battle. Carolina, you've come back just in the right time because you're about to speak.
Wow, you have been waiting for me. So thank you so much for this fascinating discussion, and I would like just to make 3 points to connect to some things that have been said during this panel. So there is a lot about disillusionment in this panel, disillusionment with the European Union as such, with Germany particularly, also echoing what Gerald said in the last panel. But what if disillusionment is actually a good thing? What if it produces an important and valuable reflection? And this actually brings me very much to Germany, because I have been saying before that many neighbors of Russia have been repeating over and over again, we were right, we knew it, right? But if any country has been proven really wrong in the past few weeks and months, it was Germany. So perhaps this is good so, because, so to say, German politics must find itself anew, construct itself anew. You might say that for the past 16 years, Germany's politics under Angela Merkel was basically about consolidating the status quo. The problem is that there is no status quo anymore, right? The status quo changes every week or every day. So if it is actually valuable that there is this disillusionment and that Germany and the European Union have to reflect on its position in politics. When I think about it, I basically think about how interesting job was done by our panelists, our speakers, colleague from the Green movement, namely Annalena Baerbock. So she has really become a face of this German change, the Zeitenwende. I think it's very important to grasp that. Now, the second point connects to what Ivan said about public opinion. So we tend to criticize European Union for its lack of haste in changing itself, and also lack of ways to engage people to this flag with the golden stars. So the question is, can we learn from the Ukrainians again a bit? Because we have been talking a lot about values and habits and emotions and interests, etc., but we haven't been talking about entertainment. And in the time of social media, entertainment is perhaps also a very important part of how you engage citizens. Well, look at Zelensky, right? This person not only appears on the opening of Cannes and various festivals. This is a politician who has been dancing in leather and on heels a couple of years ago. And when this is shown now, it's very viral, by the way, in my country, to show those videos. And it's not taking anything of his legitimacy. To the contrary, because this is an extremely entertaining guy who has grown up to his role. So it's very convincing. I wanted to make a third point, but I think
we're better move on,
Yeah.
Carolina, simply because we are running out of time, and I appreciate it if you cede the floor to Dimitrov Bechev right next to you.
Yeah, thanks. I was just reflecting on something Ivan said about US borders. And I think that he said that you should know where the borders are in order to defend them. But I think the actual reality is that the borders will remain fuzzy. And Ukraine is part of the story. I mean, Ukraine will be part of the regulatory space and the integration space. But those areas in the occupation, in the Russian occupation, will also be covered. I mean, think about somebody in Melitopol. They are likely to retain their Ukrainian passport because that will be a way to travel in the future to the EU. There's the same in Transnistria. We have a precedent. In Transnistria, which now trades heavily with Moldova, everyone has a Moldovan passport. Or in Northern Cyprus. So this fuzziness will be there no matter what we think it will be. Turkey is another aspect. Turkey won't be a member, but it's doing the job of protecting the EU borders because it absorbs migrants and it's aligning with good chunk of the legislation. And despite the Erdogan factor, that will remain the case. So I don't think the EU by nature is capable of drawing a line. It's supposed to be open-ended, and it's supposed to be expansionist. And we've lived in this predicament for a long time, and we know how to do it, sort of thing. I think that's for granted. So not much change there, I'm afraid. Secondly, who is doing the job of protection? And Slavek hinted at that. I think it's NATO. At the end of the day, it will be the Americans underwriting European security. And that's one of the takeaways from this war. Despite the German change of heart, spending on defense, and by the way, we have to see how the money is allocated. This is going to pay for pensions or for capabilities. So we attempted, when you see a grand geopolitical event, to think about dramatic changes and discontinuities. But I'm afraid there is a lot of inertia and a lot of structural factors at play that actually won't change over time.
Thank you, Dimitrov. And then on to Anna, if I may.
Also I want to make one point, maybe it's quite obvious, but I want to talk about Russian gas and how Europe depends on it. And I think it's, like we're here in Austria, and as we know, Austria gets like 80% of gas from Russia. And I think this is what the European Union can do, like right away, like to start to develop alternative like sources, and like I think this is like it's absurd that Europe actually funding Putin's war, and it's. I think this is like what I know it's a difficult discussion, and it's not so easy, but it's also would like long time also it would also do like it was planned already, like it's not good for climate change, and this would be now the point for Europe to do something really urgent and like really develop, put a lot of money and energy resources to develop alternative sources of energy.
Thank you, Anna. Nicola Dimitrov.
Thank you, Misha. It's a question, so I'm going to be brief. First, I think I'd like to speak on behalf of Cevapcici. I think we have to defend this important meal, very tasty in the region, and do everything that we can to prevent it becoming a symbol of European hypocrisy and realpolitik in a way in the Balkans. So my question is, because of the experience and the hurdles and the vetoes that we've been going through, the brand of the EU, the question, do you consider the European Union to be a reliable friend and partner? In the public polls dropped from 43% to 9% in a matter of 2 years in Macedonia, in North Macedonia. So I think Europe will lose a lot if it stops leading by an example, this value-based appeal. So my question to Ivan is it conceivable, if we have a credible, realistic offer on the table, if we re-energize the enlargement process, can we maybe demand from Vučić both rule of law and free media, and full alignment with the CFCP, and make that maybe even equally important? Sort of treat CFCP as if with the same importance that we treat fundamentals in the first cluster. Demand more, but be ready to really deliver.
Okay, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to ask Stefan, then Heather, and then Gerald to finish off. All stentorian contributors, but please, I'm going to cut you off if you run too long, because I want to open it up to the floor, and then at the end I want Ivan to have 5 minutes to respond to all of these extraordinary points that have been made. So, Stefan, far away.
Thank you very much. I want to pick up Ivana's question at the beginning of our discussion, the kind of potential for transformation through a new convention, basically, if I understood correctly. Basically, there are two methods of transformation in the EU. The one is through treaty change. We had 5 big treaty changes in the first decades. We got stuck with the Lisbon Treaty. Afterwards, this way of transformation was more or less given up because it became too difficult with enlargement, with referenda. It became some sort of a Russian roulette, and we were shy of it. And then came the new form of transformation, which Luc van Middelaar described so well, and that is transformation through improvisation under the pressure of crisis. And it's amazing things what happened during these last 12 years, much more basically than in the previous 12 years. We had massive changes in the financial architecture, in the financial crisis. We had massive change on the attitude and border management in the refugee crisis. We had the deal with Turkey on refugees. We had in COVID, we had the vaccination program, we have the reconstruction fund, and now with the Ukraine crisis, we sent weapons to attacked countries. None of this was provided for in the treaty. But it worked. It's the transition from rule-making to executive action. And now we have an interesting moment because the two things are coming together. The European Parliament is asking for a new convention. They want desperately to go back to the previous method because the driver of the other transformation was the European Council, and the European Parliament was more or less marginalized in this process. But the attitudes of the member states are uneven. Some of them are against it, some of them are open up to a point, but if something comes out of it, it will be very minimalistic. And I have no doubt that the kind of other methods, transformation through improvisation, will be the prevailing one for the next 5 to 10 years, for the very simple reasons that the crisis will not end. We will continue to face one crisis after the other, and I think Olivier was very good in pointing out how tough the situation will be. And the only thing that makes me sometimes a little bit optimistic that in the course of the 12 years, the EU has actually got a lot better in this second type of transformation. I think there is more coherence and more effectiveness and more responsiveness of the EU in this process.
That's a very good point. By the way, I was leaving Stefan and Heather towards the end because I hoped that they were going to be a little more upbeat, and I'm taking Stefan's contribution as upbeat. Heather.
Well, you can decide whether I'm upbeat or not, because I think the test for the EU is whether the transformation through improvisation method will work for the next most important transformation, which is to make the EU much more resilient to Russian influence, and particularly to wannabe autocrats who now want to use the war as a get-out-of-jail-free card to let them off. The danger of the Cevapcici trade-off is that when you sit down with Vučić, as Ivan was saying, and you say, are we going to talk about the war, or are we going to talk about rule of law? Nobody wants to talk about rule of law. But without rule of law, what you have is systemic corruption, which allows the Kremlin to put not only its narratives through our media and its money through our political parties and corrupt individuals, as we've seen on a wide scale. I mean, in Italy and Germany, even here in Austria, there was a famous video, remember? But also, if we don't have rule of law and the protection of democratic institutions and democratic practice, then we're simply going to allow the Kremlin to continue meddling in the very fundamentals of our democracy. So how can we create a Kremlin proofing of the European Union? And it's very hard to do that through improvisation, because actually what you need is an acquis communautaire, a rule book, which has much stronger, much clearer safeguards for rule of law, clearer standards for democratic practice, you know, what is independence of the judiciary, what counts as legitimate and not, and also much better anti-corruption mechanisms. We have this tiny underfunded European public prosecutor, for example. So these are not things that necessarily require treaty change, and I think that treaty change is a terribly sterile debate now because, as you say, too many countries need a referendum, too many leaders are just not interested. But it's got to happen somehow, because otherwise we will be facing the next series of crises that Olivier was right to point out, the food crisis, which will drive lots more refugees refugees, the water crisis that is looming in North Africa, and indeed the climate crisis, which is not in 20 years' time, as Ivan was saying, it's now. So we need to start building this resilience. And Russia has already undermined our resilience to the extent that it took a war to change German thinking about being Russenversteher forever and about relying on Russian hydrocarbons. We can't afford to have another crisis to make our politicians brave again. We've only got this one, so we need to start using it.
Thank you, Hedda. And now we're going to attempt the impossible. We're going to get Gerald to speak for just 1 minute. So, Gerald, that's all you've got, and then I'm going to cut you in because we must go to the floor.
Yes, well, in 1 minute, the point Ivan said about staying power has, of course, to do with presenting a convincing vision why different, including European Union citizens, should sacrifice. And what we've seen in the German debate is that this debate is completely defensive. You know, to your question of whether you might imagine freedom of movement, which is something that you get, you know, within European integration. For Ukrainians, the answer was Syrian refugees, of which in the last year, 2021, just to give you the numbers, the total number of Syrian and Afghan refugees who crossed into the EU in 2021 is 9,000. So, you know, you really see a shifting of the idea that we are dealing with a big country that we want to integrate, whose people we want to bring close, that we want to see rebuilt in the way the EU succeeded in Romania or Poland through integration. This is not part of the debate yet in Germany, but it is in other countries of Central Europe, and that's the debate of the next few weeks that one must win. And it is different from buying oil and gas, whether it's Arab states or Libya or Russia. You know, that was always a German spin, that this will build peace. You know, that's never bought peace. Not before 1914, not now. What has worked is the kind of model of really unique, deep integration, including institutional, that makes borders invisible. That has been one of the most successful innovations, and it has lasted. It's still there. You know, that has not been challenged. And last word on the staying power, the vision is actually very simple. Since 1990, we've had so many wars in those countries that were not part of the European Union and not part of NATO. You know, dozens of wars. You know, Karabakh, Transnistria, Abkhazia, Ossetia, Chechnya, Ukraine. I mean, list and list and list, not to mention the Balkans. In the other part of Europe, those who were members of the EU and NATO, we didn't have any wars. Now, one big country, one small country want to transit from one part of Europe, where we will have the next 20 years more wars, unless this changes, to the Europe of integration and peace. Are we ready to accept them?
I told you it was an impossible task. It proved to be impossible. However, by Gerald's standards, that was incredibly pithy. So now I'm going to go to the floor. Questions, please. And we've got about 7 minutes before I hand back to Ivan. I can't see a thing. I can now. Got one behind Solly, first of all, and then Solly. In fact, I'm always discriminating against the Turks, as you know, Solly. But you can ask your question straight after, so we'll take 2 questions.
Yana Barinova, I'm a former city councillor for culture of city of Kiev. 2 months ago I moved to Vienna, and currently I'm working for the Erste Foundation. So I would like to ask the question about talent integration. And it's about smart integration program of refugees. I don't really like this word. I don't position myself personally as a refugee. I am temporarily relocated person. I would love to come back to my country and to rebuild it. Just to bring several examples. For example, chief legal officer of our Office for Culture of City of Kiev was forced to leave Ukraine, and now she is in Munich. She is the great specialist in legal issues, but unfortunately there is no something like talent integration hub that will help people with great competences, great skills to find the most use for both countries, the country to which you arrive and to your homeland. So I think that some programs or foundations or new institutions should be launched. And it's not only about where physically to place refugees or some legal administrative issues. So I spent 2 months for this, and now this is the question, how to bring use for Austria, for Ukraine, how to build these bridges. Also, we should understand the demographical issue, that up to 5 million people leave Ukraine already, and most of them are women with children. 65% of government servants in Ukraine are women, and many of them left their countries. So I witness a huge brain drain from Ukraine. So what kind of solution can be offered by you, by European institutions, to integrate these talents and these minds? So this is my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Solly, you go next.
Thank you. I had a Czech professor who once said, this was during the Cold War, you cannot trivialize an empire. And I used that trying to analyze the war in Ukraine. Hearing what Olivia said twice already, I'm wondering if we're going to be changing the phrase that you won all the battles but you lost the war to you lost all the battles but you won the war, because that's her argument. And if she is correct, and already the Americans lost the Congo to the Chinese, the French lost the Sahel and all these other, Mali and all the rest, to the French.
To the Russians.
I'm sorry, to the Russians. And now she says, whatever way the unsuccessful tactical part of the war may have gone, strategically the Russians may end up having the upper hand. So the question to Ivan, therefore, is, does that change your analysis?
Thank you. We've got time for 2 more questions, and I stress the word questions here because we must let Ivan have a decent crack at the end. I can't really... all right, there, wherever, sorry, there's a microphone there already.
Hi, it's Leszek again. So, Ivan, do you think that the existential threats of war means that the tendencies are more for integration because we have external enemy, which should be common for the whole EU, or because the stakes are so high, we cannot afford to compromise on oil, on climate change, on defense, on American intervention, on illiberalist tendencies, because in certain parts of Europe, countries will consider that it doesn't matter because we took refugees. I'm from Poland, for those who don't know. So do you think that because the stakes are so high right now, do you think that we will see more common action and integration in the EU, or actually more disintegration, because those countries cannot afford to lose on the national interest?
And one more question. Is that you, Alison?
Hello, I'm Alison Smale, a journalist, and I just would like to throw up a situation that I'm in personally. My Russian nephew has arrived in Vienna. He cannot access his bank account, just like many other Russians in the same position. It seems to me folly to be outraging this group of people who mostly have got jobs in the West, who have fled their country because they're afraid of being conscripted into the army, and are being prevented access to the money that they actually hold. It seems really silly to make these people angry, since surely aren't they the kind of Russians we'd really like to be dealing with all across the board?
Thank you. Okay, exactly 5 minutes, Ivan, for you to answer all those questions.
Thank you very much. Of course, nobody expects me to answer the questions, but I'm just going to touch on the base of the questions. How I see the big picture, and here, of course, Solly was right on the question, what is going to change, basically, my view, what is going on. With Stefan, I very much believe that European Union, for good or bad, is going to be transformed, but response to crisis, and not only this crisis, because if the food crisis and energy crisis is real, in 6 months we're going to have another problem to dance with. So it's not that for the next 1, 2, or 3 years we're going to deal only with Ukraine. And this is why this crisis is changing the pace of the decision making. They're putting a different pressure on the countries. And on the question of who is going to win or not, I do believe that the states and the member states have been in a certain way strengthened by this crisis, but they didn't have any other option than now to go for much more cooperative behavior within the European Union. It was not that the Commission became stronger. Talking about climate, which I found, by the way, a very important issue, and the security issue. Psychologists claim that if you have two threats, one coming from a human agent and another from kind of a non-human agent, it's much easier to mobilize with human agents. Nobody is going to understand why Germans have been fighting like crazy for the Nord Stream 2 if you don't know that it was their climate policy. This is how they wanted to do the transition. This is why she prioritized, and the major reason was that Germany decided to close the nuclear powers. So they're going to be interesting decisions. It does not mean that Germany should decide to open the nuclear power stations, but they can allow others around them to open, and because you're going to have a common electricity market, this could be compensated. But this changes, and this goes to deeply held values. I see the situation for the last 30 years, and this is answering solely like this. I do believe that in 1992, 4 very different, totally interconnected and fragile projects started in Europe. One was basically Maastricht European Union, which was much deeper cooperation than basically the European community, which was expanding. And basically, this was a postmodern empire with an open borders, expanding as far as it can go. The other was the attempt to create a post-imperial Russia. In all its history, Russia was only an empire. This was the only continental empire which survived basically through the transformation of the Soviet Union, totally different state, but it was there. The third was the post-Kemalist Turkey. It is a totally different project than the one that we knew. And the fourth was the emergence of a newly born states. In the 1990s, there were more new independent states that have been born in Europe than in Africa in the 1970s. And all these projects have been in a very interesting correlations. Many of these independent states wanted to become part of the European Union, so this is the idea of the member state building came from. But they have a different trajectory, different history. Post-imperial Russia as a project collapsed. And by the way, we are going to have an interesting Russian session. The really interesting question is, what is going to be at the core of the post-Putin's Russia identity? 2 things cannot be anymore. One is the World War II victory, because it was totally changed. The other was simply Russian culture and Russian language, which was also very much challenged. And if you have these projects basically going together, for the European Union, the biggest story was that our strategy was based on the idea of a globalized and globalizing world. All this idea of the regulatory power, of kind of trying to develop this presence of European Union as a non-military power that really have a global influence, was based on the fact that globalization, in one form or the other, is going to survive. If you're really going to see a bipolar world, a polarized world, we are not going to be a regulatory power in the way we have been talking about, because Americans are not going to allow us to regulate their technology sector. And believe me, the Chinese are not going to allow us to do it. And then comes the problem of the natural resources. Honestly speaking, I do believe, I very much agree, Olivia, with most of your analysis. You were slightly over-strategizing Russians. And the story was, Russia was very much about self-reliance. So they have these policies, but not so much to influence us. But because President Putin was so much traumatized of the experience of the 1990s, and from his point of view, it looks like this. How was it possible nuclear power, nuclear state to disintegrate, when nuclear means a kind of uncontested sovereignty? And then he decided to create a self-reliance on everything. Currency reserves, which now is sanctioned. Trying to be foot totally self-reliance. So it was not thinking so much in terms of Russia's global presence, it was very much about island Russia. Of course, how this is going to change now, it's true, and by the way, the isolation also Alice is talking about, this is not an easy issue, because Russia is isolated in the West. Russia is not isolated in a non-Western world. And we should be also very clear about this. And we should also basically not blame other peoples for doing this. In the way we care differently about Ukrainian refugees and Syrian refugees, we should not be surprised that Syrians care differently. And here I'm going to stop because Misha is looking at me.
I'm very sorry. There's nothing that any of us like better than listening to Ivan all evening, but I'm being told that it's over, and yes. Boris is here, and I'm frightened.
It's over.
Thank you.
No,
You haven't got sound.
1, 2, 3, 4. Can you give me? No, it doesn't work.
You can talk through me.
Yeah. Wait, no, I'll talk here. Wait. So I don't have much to say. Except the fact now we owe a drink. We have a short break and then we go for the last session. This was very exciting. Thank you very much. And thank you, Misha.